I request everyone to please put your mobile phones on silent mode for a smooth conduct of seminar. The meeting is being streamed online via Google Meet, so you can ask your friends to attend the same. The link is shared on social media handles of Gokhale Institute. We will have the Q&A segment towards the end of the session. Also requesting everyone to please sign the attendance sheet before leaving the hall. Good evening, everyone. I, Bhavna, welcome you all on behalf of the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, Pune, for the special research presentation under our Thursday seminar series. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Ishan Anand, Assistant Professor of Economics at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Delhi. He has completed his PhD in Economics from Jawaharlal Nehru College, New Delhi. Dr. Anand's research focuses on critical issues such as inequality, caste, agriculture, and development. A recipient of the prestigious World Bank Robert S. McNamara Fellowship, University of Massachusetts, Amherst 2016-17, he has previously taught at Ambedkar University, Delhi, and OP Jindal Global University. His work has earned him several accolades, including the Rudder Dutt Memorial Best Paper Award at the 61st Annual Conference of the Indian Society of Labour Economics in 2019. His recent publications include studies on recent trends in wealth inequality in India, Dalit emancipation and the land question, and the sky and the stratosphere, wealth concentration in India during the last lost decade. We look forward to hearing his insights today. The topic of today's seminar is Economics of Caste in Ambedkar. Herein, Sir will discuss his recent paper that seeks to address the limited literature on caste within economic thought by focusing on the economic analysis of caste in the works of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Drawing from Ambedkar's writing and speeches, it explores how caste mediates and sustains economic hierarchies and exploitation. His paper also examines Ambedkar's proposals for addressing the privileges and deprivation resulting from the caste system, arguing that his ideas offer valuable insights into the economic aspects of contemporary caste issues. But before I call upon the speaker, I would like to request our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Ajit Ranade, to felicitate our guest.
Thank you, Bhavna. So I join her and all of you in welcoming Dr. Vishal. And this is a topic of obviously great interest and relevance. And as she said in her introduction of your work, that there's not that much work in this area. So that makes it all the more important for us to have your views on this. And I mean, what can I say? This is such a big topic, so I don't want to take too much time. Any discussion, especially from a scholarly and scholarly angle, trying to get understanding, a deeper insight, is always welcome. And at Gokhale Institute, we value such scholarship. And we also, as for your information, Gokhale Institute is about 100 years old, and we are under one roof, having programs in economics and allied sciences, including demography and so on. And we have several centers. So one center is called Center for Study of Social Exclusion and Inclusive Policies. That was set up in 2008, I think. So about 16 years ago. So that actually center does work on, but it's mostly empirical work on various studies related to marginalized communities, including not just let's say from the angle of caste, but also perhaps gender and so on. So there is great interest, and a lot of PhD scholars also work in this area. And historically also, I think Gokhale Institute has done a lot of work. In fact, many of our faculty also are doing research in this. So this is very relevant. So thank you for coming here, and I hope you come here for longer so you can give a series of lectures. Thank you, and over to you. Thank you.
Now, I would like to call upon the stage our esteemed guest, Dr. Ishan Anand. The stage is all yours, sir. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here at the heart of political economy in India. And I would like to thank the Gokhale Institute, not just for having me here, but also being, providing this great resource of, on the political economy theme for generations. So we have all benefited a lot from that. Thank you, ma'am. And so it's a pleasure to be here. Now this paper is it's a work in progress. It's co-authored with Dr. Saket Moon, who is a historian from JNU. He couldn't be here, so he's missing, the hospitality that I'm getting here. Um Now the it's called, as you can see, it's called Economics of Caste in Ambedkar. Now the motivation that we had was the fact that we started looking at the history of Indian economic thought. Now, not a lot of economists nowadays do history of economic thought, but those who do understand that it can be a very, very valuable resource. So understanding how the discipline has evolved over time, what were the debates, what were the different strands, is it a are there agreements, and is there consensus on the foundations of economics, or are these contested terrains? So understanding that can give us a lot more clarity on even contemporary questions, even empirical questions. So that was our motivation. So we started to look at history of Indian economic thought, and then we realized there is some work. There is not a lot of work, but there is some work on nationalist thinkers, on Gokhale, on Ranade, on Siddhat, on and other thinkers, and there is limited work on Ambedkar. Of late, there has been a resurgence, though. So post 2000s, and especially in the last year itself, there were 6 books on Ambedkar. So there has been a resurgence in the last few uh, 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 decades, and in the last year, definitely a lot more interest. Now, what we realized was, while there is a lot more work coming up on Ambedkar, what is missing is his views, or an explicit treatment of his views on economics of caste. So we have books on Ambedkar's philosophy, on his contributions as an economist, on him, on Ambedkar, his biographies, so on and so forth. But what about his economic treatment of caste? So that is kind of understudied. So that is where we said, okay, let's look at how Ambedkar understood caste as an economic institution. Of course, it has other aspects as well, but we focus on just one, that is caste as an economic institution, and Ambedkar, what he had to say on it. So that is where we sort of intervene. And again, so there are a lot of quotes here. So as we read Ambedkar, we had this feeling that now, there are quotes that we should share with others also. So there are a lot of quotes. It's okay if you're not able to read everything. It's there in the paper. Paper will be uploaded online. It's on SSRN already. So there are, while I said that there are fewer studies on economics of caste in Ambedkar, nonetheless there are studies. And I don't want to go into a detailed review here, but people like Ashwini Deshpande, who has in her uh, grammar of caste. So there is a section on Ambedkar. There are much more recent studies. So V Gita has few. She has a book. She has a book chapter. Suratkar has a fantastic essay in EPW on how Ambedkar dealt with questions of caste and class. And there are a few other studies. So we build upon this literature. We contribute to this literature. The thing is, the main contribution coming out of this project is that while these studies look at specific aspects of materiality of caste, so V Gita, for instance, in a chapter looks at untouchability and inequality. So how Ambedkar has used inequality. Suratkar looks at how Ambedkar had viewed caste and class issues. Other scholars had viewed, looked at specific aspects of materiality of caste. What we do here is we say, okay, first of all, we'll provide an overview of several aspects, several economic aspects of caste. So what has Ambedkar got to say on these? The second thing that we try to do from this is, while reading Ambedkar can be a fruitful exercise on its own, we also find that from this study, comes out a very, very powerful framework. So if we look at what Ambedkar had to say about caste from on different aspects, it could be a descriptive analysis that we have done. We have documented what Ambedkar had said about caste. But the second part of the project which I would admit requires required some more work and separate treatment. But we do allude to this in this paper. Is that once we have documented that, we can start to see that there are these pillars of this framework emerging, which we can use to analyze caste in a much better way compared to the existing, let's say, neoclassical theories or even other heterodox theories. So that is insight that we can draw from the works of Ambedkar. So let's begin now. How do we do this study? We restricted ourselves to the works of Ambedkar. So again, we are not trying to theorize caste here, because that would mean looking at several anti-caste thinkers and even other thinkers. What we are trying to do is to locate at the history of economic thought, focus on that part. So what is Ambedkar's contribution? We look at his writing, speeches, his submission to committees, so on and so forth. And there is a great resource freely available. It's called Baba Sahib Ambedkar Writings and Speeches. The government of Maharashtra started printing it, and now the union government has done it. It's on the MEA website. Just a Google search would give you all 21 volumes. Up until 17 volumes, it's in English, rest is in Marathi. Uh, so this is our source. But again, we look only specifically for narrowly defined economics of caste aspects in this gamut of Ambedkar's work. What we present here is a historical analysis. So Ambedkar is obviously referring, talking to his time. He's communicating to the masses, communicating with intellectuals, with governments, with commissions. But he is responding to the anxieties of his time. So what we have done here is, in order to maintain historical sensitivity, we have we have used the terms as it is, right? So he uses a lot of terms to describe different groups. So we have kept the terms as it is. And so that is just a housekeeping kind of an announcement, that for instance, although untouchability is abolished, so then why are we using that term? We're using the term just to maintain historical sensibilities. That's it. First thing that I want to talk about is the fact that when we do any study, typically we define a unit of analysis. Sometimes we do it explicitly, sometimes we just assume, but there has to be a unit of analysis. In standard microeconomic theory, it is either a firm or a household or a representative agent, but that is the unit of analysis. In different schools, you could have different units of analysis. Ambedkar was writing in he was writing mid 1918 onwards, or 1916 onwards. That is when his first sort of major work, Castes in India, came, and he's been writing continuously since then up until almost very end of his life. Very early on in his writings, uh, one can find that he is vehemently opposed to methodological individualism. So there is actually a fantastic quote. I think it's up. We'll be able to show. So in the quote, he argues that this has become almost vulgarized to look at the society from the prism, from the lens of an individual. And a society is the fact that society is obviously made up of an individuals, but that is a trivial statement. As far as analysis is concerned, it is always made up of class. So so in that sense, Ambedkar is actually much closer to the classical political economists, the Smiths, Ricardo, Marx, Malthus, so on and so forth. So that is an important point about it's an important methodological point. So very often in contemporary caste studies or group studies, we tend to focus on representative agents. Now, it's not just a matter of choice of the framework. The point is, the choice of a specific framework can dictate the direction that the study takes, and the policy recommendations that you would come up with. So the choice of the framework is very important. So that is the first point that I want to make. So what is his preferred unit of analysis? Ambedkar's preferred unit of analysis is class and caste. So throughout his study, he uses class a number of times, caste a number of times, and he uses it in a variety of ways. So it is not necessarily strictly comparable to, let's say, a Smithian or a Marxian or a Ricardian class, because Ricardo, for instance, was very clear. Landlords, capitalists, and workers. So was Marx. Ambedkar uses it in a slightly different sense. Uh, in Ambedkar, classes could be intellectual, they could be social, they could be economic. So that is where he differentiates himself from the socialists of the time. He's saying classes are not necessarily economic. Theory of doing a, you know, quote unquote, a mere class analysis or an economic class analysis. The political philosophy the closer political philosophy would be liberalism, where, capitalism is emerging out of a mix of state and church and a feudal structure, and liberalism is believed to be liberalism feels, it's very important in liberalism. So individual liberty, individual freedom is extremely important in that tradition. But from there, from a particular political, social, economic context, when we start to theorize a society in terms of individuals and we take it out of the context, that may create, methodological problems, particularly when we are dealing with group inequalities. So, for instance, if we are looking at group inequalities and we are taking individual representative agents, and then we are saying an individual, so, somebody is not performing well, and then it is down to that individual. So then essentially we may be claiming, explicitly or implicitly, that all individuals in that group are actually somehow, inferior or less meritorious, or so on and so forth. So the, methodological individualism, or class or caste as a unit of analysis may make a lot of difference in the kind of study that we are trying to do. So Ambedkar's, you know yeah so yeah. Right. So classes could be economic, it could be intellectual, it could be social. That is how. So this is from Annihilation of Caste. He's differentiating himself from the socialists of the time, and he's saying, look, mere economic interpretation of history may not be enough. There are, there is a religious hold over the people. There are all kinds of social status, property, all kind of powers, and each could become dominant at different points in time, right? Then he says, look, while there are class differences all over the world, there is hardly any society which does not have class differences. What is interesting and unique in India is that it is treated, it is treated as a virtue. So it has a sanctity to it. The kind of social hierarchies we have is sanctified, is a claim that he makes. And then he goes on to say, yes, there are classes as a unit of analysis, but these do not exist in isolation. So there is no caste or class of its own. There are castes and castes and castes, which are related to each other, which are actually related in a very hierarchical manner. So that is his intervention. And then he's trying to abstract and say, look, we could think of a society belonging to, these two groups. One is the exterior classes, or what he calls the excluded classes, which by default presents this dichotomy of there being a social other which is in the interior of the society. So that is his framework of analysis. He is looking at classes, he is looking at hierarchical classes, and he is actually going on to say that the relationship between the different groups is actually very antagonistic. So it is not a relationship of mutual cooperation, as one would assume as one could assume. It is a particular kind of a relationship. That relationship is of antagonism, and when we see violence against one community, it is typically not a conflict of an individual with an individual, but it reasserts the class based or the caste based hierarchies. So essentially, class is at the heart, front and center of Ambedkar's interpretation of the Indian social problem of caste. All right, so I know this is a biggish quote, so it's okay if you can't read it. All I'm trying to say here is that, Ambedkar is aware that there are castes and there are classes and there is intersectionality. So typically, when we think of intersectionality, we think of race and gender. So starting 90s, Crenshaw and others in the US spoke a lot about intersectionality and how it affects black women in particular. But Ambedkar is talking about, he is also talking about gender in several instances, but he spends a lot of time discussing how an individual could be caste conscious, could be class conscious, and whether the class consciousness takes over or the caste consciousness takes over, it really depends on the circumstances in the situation. So there is a very high degree of intersectionality, and it makes another point. For instance, workers is a class, but workers as a class is not a homogeneous class, and is definitely all laborers are one. So he's saying it's an ideal to be achieved rather than something to be assumed, right? So we cannot just assume that this is one single group, but it's just something that we want to achieve. So his project, Vigita puts it very beautifully, that it's a historical project as well as an utopian project. So he's responding to historical anxieties, but he's also looking at this immense possibilities that that equalities could bring about. Okay, now we look at, so this is his framework. Having said that, we move on to specific sort of topics that he has looked. And first we look at the agrarian economy and the property relations. India was primarily agrarian even back then. Some would argue even till today. Uh, he's saying the major problem as far as the rural areas is concerned is that of dependence. So there are villages, with the villages there are associated terms of life, and within villages there are these almost inward looking units of caste. The so called or quote unquote upper castes are much more dominant, not just in terms of power and status but also in terms of population, and that is how a village unit operates. So this economic dependence is, according to Ambedkar, the key to exploitation in rural areas. And he is actually not very fond of the rural setup, and we'll see later that he keeps arguing that the salvation would lie in moving away from rural. Why is there dependence? So I you can all understand the dependence. The dependence is coming from the fact that some groups, the deprived groups or the scheduled caste groups, whatever we call it now, the then untouchables, have very little access to property of any kind. So the property relations are skewed. Some groups are landless. That, and it's not just landlessness. One could argue that you could take up some other kind of vocation, but given also the fact that education is beyond reach, given also the fact that because of untouchability, any other trade is not really readily available. Given all of this, there is economic dependence. The second point that comes here is the fact that why is there landlessness? So landlessness in Ambedkar's analysis comes from social codes and legal codes. So it's a historical process, and he's giving some examples. He's saying, look, one, there is abject poverty. So even if you want to buy land, you just don't have the resources. But that is a tautological thing. So you're poor, you don't have land, so you don't ever have enough money to buy land. But even more importantly, there are social injunctions. There are legal codes. So it's not as if you can just buy land even if you have that resource. And he gives there is a very interesting example of the Punjab Land Alienation Act that he presents. The Punjab Land Alienation Act basically, it came out with a list of classes, and it said these are agricultural classes, these are non-agricultural classes, and the sale of land could only happen within agricultural classes. So legally, so these are legal codes perpetuating caste-based land disparities. And then there are downright social injunctions that even if I'm in distress, I want to sell my land, I will not sell land to members of a particular community. So economic dependence actually perpetuates land and social and economic disparities in the rural. There are other areas that Ambedkar highlights, and one such area is what is known as the Watandari system, which is basically a hereditary office that is divided into groups, and particular groups. So Ambedkar talks about Mahars are given this particular office called Mahar Watan, where it is an office of basically village servants having to do all kinds of menial work without regular hours, without proper remuneration, without the ability to complain and get out of it, and without the ability to get out of Mahar Vatan, because Mahar Vatan is tied to some free piece of land. So if you are to own that land, if you are to cultivate, you are tied to Mahar Vatan, and you are tied to all the problems that are associated with it. So Ambedkar, of course, tried to pass a legislation at the time, saying, look, this is a situation where it is not just unpleasant labor. It is basically bondage in several forms. So he says there are lists. So he's listing about 40 types of corvée or unpaid labor that is included in the ambit of Mahar Vatan. And he is saying what should ideally happen is the freedom or the liberty of contract. Essentially meaning, if I want to work with you, I work with you. If you want to keep me, you keep me. Some sort of a contract which is enforceable. So not dogma of predisposition, in the sense that you are to not born into Vatandari, you are not born to uphold Mahar Vatan, but freedom of contract. So that is his intervention. This could not pass then. It was abolished much later after independence. But and then the third part, of course, is land reforms. We'll come to that later. So that is his. I'm when I say that is his take is distributed in 20 volumes of 5, 6, 700 pages. So I'm just presenting a very, very brief overview. He is also very mindful of this newly evolving industrialized setup. And while he is positive about industry vis-a-vis the rural and the agrarian, he actually okay, sorry. I skipped the point. So before we go to the industrial part, in the rural setup, he makes another very interesting observation that somehow economists have not latched on to, and that is again something very interesting. Basic hierarchies to be reproducing both in the public and private sectors. He gives a detailed description of the railways and other government offices, where he's saying what is the problem. So the fact that so for instance he's saying that there are no exams or interviews for pre-matriculation posts for clerks, he mentions, but the members of the untouchable community were not able to join clerks, and that he attributes to what today we think in terms of labor market discrimination, that a particular group is not hired. So he has a detailed description of that, and he is saying the then untouchable person could not become a porter, which is not really a very high officiating job, but simply because of the fact that a porter may be required to work at the station master's house, and that untouchability wouldn't allow. And then he goes on to describe not just the revolt from the mill workers and the station masters, but also from their family. So he has a description of how the wives of the touchable mill workers wouldn't allow the wives of the untouchable mill workers to use water resources in the surrounding of the mill, so on and so forth. So even in the then, so he is aware that look, there is a promise in this industrializing economy, but the hierarchies are also getting reproduced here in a very severe way. Okay, one of the most recurring themes in Ambedkar is that of segregation, and segregation of all kinds. The residential segregation we have already discussed very briefly. In villages, the untouchable families would typically live in south because it's considered uh, not an auspicious direction, but not just residential segregation. So he highlights instances of all kinds of segregation, and throughout his writing, what he does is he'll pick up report after report after report. So he'll pick up Times of India report, date January X 1931, and he'll describe an instance, and he'll use report after report after report, and then he'll come up with an analytical argument that segregation is essentially all pervasive, from travel to work to water to burial grounds, so on and so forth, cremation grounds. And the fact is that it's not a temporary or a transitory thing. So this segregation, as Ambedkar saw it, was permanent. It could not be eradicated, and what it amounted to was for the touchables, for the quote unquote upper castes, it amounted to treating the private spaces as public property. So he is talking about appropriation, and he is aware. So he did believe a lot in democratic routes in legislations, but he was aware that challenging some of these would take more, and that is why we see the Mahad, water satyagrah. In Mahad it was open. Anybody could in practice go and take water, but we saw from the backlash that that was not the case. So he is aware and he is taking steps now. Again, moving on, this is something that is very interesting. Now, typically, I mean, I'm assuming there are a lot of students of economics here. Typically, the main constraint as far as consumption is concerned in economics is the budget constraint. Right? So we all have our preferences. We have the budget constraint. If the budget constraint is relaxed, we can consume more. And if the budget line moves upwards, we move to our preferred indifference curves, so on and so forth. Ambedkar is pointing to a very different kind of a constraint. He is pointing to a social constraint on consumption. Essentially, what he is saying is consumption has a social character, and it can be determined not just by your individual budget constraint, but it can be determined by the social law or the associated terms of life of the time. So he gives an example in Annihilation of Caste and several other places actually of Balai family, a particular community, I think in Indore at that time, and that was brutally attacked because the family was, some members were serving ghee in a marriage ceremony. And he lists instances where people are not allowed to wear pagdis of a certain color, gold laces, dhotis, jewelry, etc., etc., etc. So, first of all, yes, there is abject poverty, and for a majority of the Indian population, let alone the untouchable population, some of these commodities would be out of reach. But that we understand, that's simpler to understand. He is saying, look, the untouchables must not eat rich food, even if the person can afford it. Uh, and he goes on to, so in volume 5 he is saying with the associated terms of life there is a list. He presents the entire list, the do's and the don'ts, what should the untouchables do and not do. And among that list, 2 3 stand out. One is the untouchables must not own land, property and gold. So there is a social constraint on wealth accumulation and on consumption, and consumption is tied to the social status. uh, we don't really find a lot of economic traditions looking at consumptions like this. Maybe the American institutionalist Veblen had this thought that consumption has a social character, but he characterized it very differently. But Ambedkar has this fascinating view of consumption, and how economic consumption could be determined by social and legal and other forces. Now, how is all of this maintained? So clearly, none of this sounds pleasant. It is an antagonistic social relation. It's been maintained over centuries. A lot of it is legalized. A lot of it, of course, is challenged. We are still talking about the pre-independence era. Some of it is legalized. So how is it maintained? Ambedkar is very clear. It is maintained. This whole unjust, unequal system, at its heart, it is based on violence and coercion. So there is centrality of power relations in sort of keeping these hierarchies alive. And he's saying, how does it work? So social boycott in Ambedkar is a very very powerful tool. He's saying it is not just a punishment of an individual. Let's say an individual committed a quote unquote crime of drinking water, serving ghee, wearing pagdi, so on. uh, the punishment is almost always collective. It takes a collective form, it takes collective violence, it also takes the form of social boycotts. So, and that is something that we also saw after the Mahad Satyagrah, the backlash. So he's saying violence and power plays a very, very crucial role in reproducing these hierarchies. Right now, what does he talk? So he obviously also talks a lot about emancipatory politics and policies and what can be done. Now, again, Ambedkar being a product of his time, he is writing in this. These essays are being written in the 40s, and he really wants to challenge the established order. He understands. He's saying, look, and there are debates, the national debates. Some people want to go back to the traditional villages. Some people want to empower peasant proprietorship. Ambedkar is of the opinion that if we want to break the shackles, state has to intervene in a big way. And as many economists did at that time, including industrialists who in 1944 were calling for a Bombay plan, asking essentially for a larger state intervention, Ambedkar was also of a view that look, state has to play a very, very crucial role, and he did talk explicitly about state socialism at several points in time. Where he differed from the then socialists and communists was the fact that he is saying it has to take a democratic route. Also, he is talking about a certain fundamental rights. So he is very wary. He sees that gains are being made because of the struggles, because of the new independence that is getting that we are gaining. He is saying there is progress happening. There we are gaining things, but he is wary of the power and whims of the majority. So he makes the argument in a text called State and Minorities, where he is arguing that look, there has to be a fundamental safeguard. So there has to be some rights enshrined which cannot be tampered with in the future, which has to be which is beyond the possibility of amendment from a parliamentary majority. Moving on, again, this we had discussed. He is talking about several remedies. So the first thing he is saying, look, there is inequality based on several things. It could be individual attributes, it could be hard work, it could be anything, but there are also other issues. So he is making this position very clear that what I really want is equalization of race, equalization at the beginning of the race. Now, how do you do that? So again, in states and minority, he talks about a few things. One, he's saying, look, if we want to get rid of discrimination or let's say untouchability without a specific legal remedy, it remains a promise. So he is talking about constitutional safeguards. So states and minorities actually, so when the drafting committee was formed, Ambedkar said, okay, now a drafting committee is in place. The Scheduled Caste Federation has asked me to submit a memorandum to the drafting committee of what their interests are and what is expected out of the drafting committee. And he is, so it's written in a form of a constitution. It has articles, it has clauses, it has explanations. So he goes on to talk about different kinds of safeguards, safeguards from social boycott, ban on untouchability, legal, judicial, etc., measures. He's talking about special safeguards. He's then moving on to representation, and then he lists representation in governments, public employment, and so on in the proportion of the population. But his larger view, which we discussed, is that there has to be a movement from villages where the dependence is so strong that some households essentially live in a ghetto and they cannot break away from that dependence. So he is optimistic that a movement from the villages to the urban areas, rapid urbanization and industrialization, may open up greater possibilities. Although, as we discussed, he is aware that it also has its own problems. And then lastly, he talks a lot about different kinds of reforms. So he is talking to the communists and saying not just economic reforms, but he also needs social reforms. So he's talking about reforms on several fronts. Now, this is, I know I've sort of rushed through 18 volumes, but this is kind of the crux of it. Now, what do we, if this is the description that Ambedkar has, what do we take out of it? Other than the pleasure of reading Ambedkar, can we draw a framework, which is important in its own right? One should do it. Now, this is our argument. The studies of caste, gender, race, religion, tribes, communities can be done through different lenses. In the works of Ambedkar, there is a discussion or there is a lens of structural inequality. So again, the students of economics would know that when we are talking about discrimination, economists typically, what we do is we are looking at labor market discrimination. So we are trying to quantify the what is known as endowment component and the discrimination component and things like that. So essentially, we are talking about a bad employer here and there. But Ambedkar is saying it's a lot more than the labor market alone. So he's talking about structural inequality. What I mean we are drawing that he's talking about structural inequality. What we mean from that is that there are structures that are privileging certain groups and that are creating a lot more disadvantages for the other groups. So even if there is a one time upward mobility, so let's say there is a very hardworking individual who sees an upward, one-time upward mobility, keep in mind that there are always these structures that are pushing that individual back, whereas there are other structures that are pushing some other individuals at a higher and higher levels. Now, what are these structures? These structures are things that we just discussed. It could be the social codes, it could be the legal codes, it could be, property relations, it could be opportunity holding in terms of education and other opportunities, so on and so forth. So rather than looking at caste from a much narrower lens of the labor market alone and labor market discrimination alone, from Ambedkar we can have this theorization. And by the way, this is a theorization that the feminist economic school they are using of late in the last 20 years, 30 years or so. Economists looking at race relations in the US, they have started to look at this and they are calling it stratification economics, where they are saying, look, racial inequalities are structural, and individual explanations can't take us very far. But we see from Ambedkar that this framework was there in India from the 1930s and 40s and 50s. The second thing that we can draw from this is that he views caste as a dynamic and a revolving institution and a evolving institution. So very often, lot of us economists, policymakers, political scientists, sociologists, several of us may have a tendency to view caste as a residual or a vestige or an archaic structure of the past that is bound to disappear on its own. Now, that is not how Ambedkar views it, because keep in mind, caste is not new. We have gained independence relatively, a few decades ago, but this structure, unequal structure, has been persisting for a long time. And Ambedkar theorizes that it has evolved. It is dynamic in the sense that it changes forms. Now, I am not saying that the structure has not weakened at all. That is not the claim I am making. The claim that I am making is we should look at it not necessarily as a residual but as a dynamic thing. So, for instance, recent studies have found that in newer areas, let's say the gig sector or newer areas which does not historically traditionally align with a particular caste, also see caste based hierarchies being reproduced. So there are several studies now, empirical studies, which kind of justifies this point that it is an evolving structure. It may be weakening, but nonetheless it is evolving. Last, or one of the last major points that one can take from this is that Ambedkar views caste as a relational problem, in the sense that for him caste is a social relation, economic, cultural, political, so on and so forth, but it is a social relation. Now please take a look at the quote. If you can see, basically the quote is saying, and a lot of policies believe based on that we focus at one end of the distribution. So we figure out a headcount ratio, or we through some measure we figure out that there is a particular group that is not doing very well. It can be a caste group and it can be a class group, and we focus our energies in trying to uplift that group through a variety of policy measures. That would not be a relational problem. That would be a problem, so as if the poverty and misery at one end is not related to the other end at all. But Ambedkar's work teaches us as economists to look at these hierarchies and deprivation in terms of a process and in terms of a relational problem where we could relate privileges and disadvantages, and then we study it together. So focusing just at one end would not give us the we would not be able to appreciate the entirety of the problem. So it's a relational problem. All right. So from all of this, what do we conclude? One, it is a pleasure to read Ambedkar. Secondly, it is important in itself, intrinsic reasons, but it is also important in an instrumental sense. What is the instrumental reason? So if we want to go back to the original source, so to speak, of course there are other thinkers. There is Phule. There are a lot of other thinkers that we can go back to detailed. So it's the original source of understanding caste. So anybody working on caste would can only benefit and enrich their work by looking at the detailed, rich description and the analytical content in Ambedkar. Second thing is his contribution in the history of Indian economic thought, which has gone unnoticed. also needs to be brought to the fore. The third point is, suppose somebody says, okay, we are just interested in looking at contemporary problems. So we are looking at disparities today. You know, do we gain anything? Now, from Ambedkar's study, we figure out that yes, you do. First of all, a lot of these mechanisms are still at play. So the mechanisms that Ambedkar is describing, social codes, consumption, riding a horse on your wedding, so on and so forth. So a lot of these mechanisms are still alive. The centrality of violence may still be alive, albeit in a weaker form, thanks to the measures that Ambedkar and others policy makers at that time put in place. But several of these mechanisms are still at play. That's point number one. The second point is, even though a lot of mechanisms have weakened over the years, uh, because there is an intergenerational transmission of privileges and disadvantages, particularly in terms of wealth, a lot of outcomes that we see today is a result of processes that Ambedkar was discussing yesterday. So, to give you a very quick example, I did mention Punjab Land Alienation Act 1900s that Ambedkar discusses. If you go to the land data, any latest land data, NSSO, IHDS, and look at which state is the most unequal in terms of caste groups, hardly surprising, it is Punjab. So massive landlessness in Punjab, and one could trace the roots. So not just this, one could you could now start to draw links of historically accumulated privileges and disadvantages. So there is a lot to gain for economists from Ambedkar, and we should read him more often. Thank you.
Through this session, we got an interesting take on how, in reality, consumption and accumulation has a social character. Sir also gives an outlook on the impacts of the all pervasive nature of segregation that existed and led to reproduction of caste hierarchies in both public and private industrial economy.